Good day, guys. So today we are looking at the AWS from the security standpoint, and our focus will be on the key management as a service, and we are trying to explore, data protection as one of the domain. So we will be looking at encryption and decryption mechanisms. We can implement encryption in some of the below services, by leveraging KMS, EBS, EFS, S3, RDS, and DynamoDB. However, in our video, we will be focusing on a variety of the scenarios for encrypting and decrypting data, which is residing on S3. So we'll be looking at both the categories, server-side encryption as well as client-side encryption, and we will be covering all those particular scenarios with a special emphasis on the server-side encryption, and we will be covering one of the scenarios for the client-side encryption as well. The very first scenario is server-side encryption using S3. So client is basically uploading data on the S3, and what happens is S3 is trying to generate a plain text data encryption key, with the help of which your object data object is getting encrypted, and therefore we are getting the encrypted data object, which will then be stored within S3. Okay, and whatever the plain text data encryption key which we have used so far, uh, with the help of S3 master key, will again be getting encrypted so as to generate the ciphertext data encryption key. And in the last process, the plain text data encryption key will be deleted from the memory. So this is the first encryption mechanism, and now we will look at the decryption process for the same. So for example, if a client tries to request a data which is stored on the S3, now we already know that on S3 basically our encrypted data object as well as encrypted data encryption key is getting stored on S3. So what we have done so far is, so what happens basically is, with the help of S3 master key and ciphertext data encryption key, we will be getting the plain text version of data encryption key. And with the help of the plain text data encryption key, we will be decrypting our encrypted data object, and hence we will be getting our plain text version of the data object, which will then subsequently be sent by S3 to the client system. Now we will be looking at server-side encryption using the KMS. So again, the client basically tries to upload the data on the S3, and S3 basically knows the data is basically encrypted using the SSE KMS as a mechanism. So S3 basically respond by initiating a request to the KMS, and then KMS will subsequently generate plain text data encryption key along with the ciphertext data encryption key. And so we can here be using AWS managed key or the customer managed key. So it basically depends on the configuration, or in the very first step, which particular so once we are using SSE KMS as an encryption mechanism, we have an option either to go ahead with the AWS managed key or the customer managed key. So in the next subsequent step, once the data encryption key in the plain text as well as ciphertext form are generated, it will be getting sent to the S3 once again. So in S3, what happens next is our data object is basically getting encrypted with the help of a plain text data encryption key, and therefore we are getting the encrypted data object. And so in S3, as previously, encrypted data object along with the ciphertext data encryption key will be getting stored. And in the last step, your plain text data encryption key will be getting deleted from the memory. Now we will be looking at the decryption process for the SSE KMS as well. When client is trying to request a data from the S3, we know, in S3 we are basically storing. So S3 is basically storing your ciphertext data encryption key as well as encrypted object. So what happens is S3 is basically initiating a request to the KMS, and within its request it will also be sending the ciphertext version of the data encryption key. So data encryption key along with the your CMK, it could be again your AWS managed key or your customer managed key. You will be getting the plain text version of data encryption key. Okay, we will be basically using your CMK to decrypt your encrypted data encryption key so as to get the plain text version of data encryption key. And this particular plain text data encryption key will then be sent to the S3 again. And again, once we come to the S3, what happens next is our encrypted data object will then be getting decrypted with the help of plain text data encryption key, and we are getting the data object. And again, the plain text version of data encryption key will then be deleted from the memory. So once we have the plain text data object, it will then again be sent to the client from the S3. So now we will be looking at the server side encryption using the customer keys. So for this particular purpose, we are not using KMS. We are not using KMS. We might be using some kind of the native solution, or maybe some other maybe in-house solution for storing the or generating the keys. Okay. So what happens is the client is basically trying to upload an object to the S3. When we are using SSEC as an encryption mechanism, we always use HTTPS or maybe secured communication channel, because in this particular method, what happens is when we are trying to upload a data object to the S3, the client will also be sending the customer key along with that particular data to the S3. So therefore, it is very, very important. Your communication will not be getting established until and unless you are using the secured channel, communication channel for this particular purpose. So once your S3 will be receiving your data as well as the customer key, what happens next is with the help of your customer key, your data is getting encrypted. Data is getting encrypted, and therefore, once your data is getting stored in the encrypted form, your customer key will then be basically removed from the memory. However, S3 will basically store or generate the HMAC salted HMAC value of the customer key, and which will then be stored along with encrypted data object on S3 for the further validation in case of if customer is requesting this particular data. So we will look at how the data is getting decrypted with this particular mechanism. So now we are looking at the decryption mechanism, when we are using the server-side encryption using the customer keys. So client is basically requesting the data. And so when the client is basically requesting a data, so the client is also sending his customer key to the S3 as well. So now what happens in the S3 next is whatever the customer key that is being received from the client, but S3 is basically trying to compare or validate this customer key with the HMAC value what it has generated. Okay, so once the validation is successful, it is able to validate whatever the customer key that is being received from the client with the help of HMAC value of the customer key. Once the validation is successful, this particular customer key will then be used to decrypt our encrypted data object, and therefore we will be getting the plain text version of our data. And once this particular plain text data is there, will again S3 will again be sending this particular plain text data to the client. So I think we will also be looking at one of the mechanisms for the client side encryption. So there are basically two scenarios, and in this particular case, we are only covering client side encryption using the customer keys. So let's get started with this. So you can see here, so with the client will basically be use an SDK. And so what happens is this particular SDK or whatever the client it is, it will be generating your random plain text data encryption key. And with this plain text version of data encryption key, it will encrypt your data object, and therefore we will be getting the encrypted version of the data object. And then subsequently, this particular plain text data encryption key will then be encrypted with the help of your customer key. and we will be getting ciphertext data encryption key. So both, so we have both at this point in time encrypted data object as well as ciphertext data encryption key. In the next step, what happens is client is basically sending your encrypted data object as well as a ciphertext data encryption key to the S3, and in the S3, your both encrypted data object as well as ciphertext data encryption key will then be stored on the S3. So this is how the encryption is taking place by leveraging client-side encryption using customer keys. So we will also be looking at the decryption process for this particular mechanism. So what happens is, client is basically making a request with the S3 to retrieve the object which is stored in the S3. So as we also know, in S3 there is always, encrypted data object is getting stored along with the ciphertext version of the data encryption key, which is stored in the metadata of our data objects. So in the subsequent step, what happens next is S3 is basically responding to the client by sending uh, your encrypted data object as well as a ciphertext data encryption key. So again, the client will be using the AWS SDK. So what it does is it will be using the customer key along with the ciphertext data encryption key. So customer key will be getting used to decrypt ciphertext data encryption key, and therefore we will be getting the plain text version of data encryption key, and this particular data plain text version of the data encryption key will then use to decrypt our data object, and hence we will be getting our plain text data object for further accessibility. So I think this is the basically intention of covering various scenarios, how we can encrypt or how we can leverage various mechanisms available for encrypting and decrypting data on S3. And so in a subsequent video, we are going to demonstrate, I'm going to demonstrate, the practical demonstration of the key management service as well. So I think by this particular video, we have a generic understandability of, how the encryption and decryption basically works on S3 at least. And so thank you guys. I mean, as we'll see you in the next.